Good morning. Welcome to the Edelman Trust Barometer. We're going to have a slight change from the usual schedule. I won't talk first. I'd like to invite to the stage Paul Polman, who really has defined trust and the idea of CEO leadership in his tenure at Unilever. And I'd like him to come to the stage and make a few remarks before I go on. Paul, to you.
Yeah, well, thanks. Okay, I won't take too much of your time because we have a very distinguished and good panel, so I'll leave it to them. But Richard asked me to say a few words, and I was just talking to Nick there, thinking the unthinkable, and I think we have a lot of things that are falling under that heading right now, and my comments would be there. The first thing I wanted to do very quickly is to thank Richard. I think it's 19th year that you're doing this, which is quite amazing, and obviously it's one of the more important events of Davos. I'm actually happy that you start with this. I apologize, I have to rush out to something else, but that you start with this because it kicks off Davos and gets people in the right mood, if you want to, and more needed than ever. First, I wanted to say that stay positive, because we have made good progress. If you look at the last 25 years, if you want to, which is not that long, we've lifted about 1.9 billion people out of poverty, and we should be very happy about that. More people have access to electricity, if you want to, access to water. There are actually more people in school. Quality is still an issue, but there are many things that we have to be happy about. Maternal health would be another one. But at the same time, it's very clear every year that we're here, we're falling behind, we're falling behind, we're falling behind. If you now look at the SDGs and the trajectory of the SDGs, we're only making about 50% of that at best if we stay at what we're currently doing. And it's obviously not helping us. I think in many of these areas, we're heading to a path of no return. And you see that especially in climate change and nature, where increasingly the Mother Earth is sending us invoices, and it's just going up. Last year again, the cost of natural disasters, and it's always the poor, by the way, that suffer from this, which is the worst thing. Oxfam just put out the report again on income gap next to climate change, the most burning issue that we have, the issues of plastics and issues of obviously, many others I could go on, but I won't for the interest of time. Now, we put some people together to see at how we can use the SDGs, which is a wonderful framework, to accelerate that and to see if we can implement it faster, because it's at the essence. We have that plan, and what we find is that people that are exposed to the SDGs with some of the work we've done with the UN Global Compact, with the commission that we created under Mark Malloch-Brown, that actually 80% of the people start integrating it. It's probably one of the best roadmaps we have and one of the biggest opportunities we have. Why do we need trust? Just to get straight to the point here, because we have really our job cut out for a second here, if I may. This is the first time that a group of people like all of us that can do something about it and should do something about it are tasked with an enormous challenge. We have to decarbonize the global economy. We frankly have never been able to do that. We're carbon junkies. We have to move the financial markets to the long term. One of the meetings I'm rushing to now, because we cannot solve all these issues that I described with this myopic focus on these quarterly reporting cycles. We have to move to a circular economy. We're basically a linear take, make, dispose, and that's obviously running out of steam. And then the most burning one is we have to create a system that is more inclusive. All of this is happening. We normally would say we can deal with it because we have responsible governments, but all of this is happening at a time that global governance is falling short, and as Richard has shown many times actually in many of the things, that the trust levels are way below what is the minimum required to solve what are increasingly global issues that I'm talking about. So the most pertinent of these, if I would single out two of them and get to some of the solutions, the most pertinent of that is definitely climate, goal number 13 if you want to, because all the other things that we talk about don't make any sense, or you're wasting your time if we don't solve the issue of climate change. In the IPCC report, we're heading for about 3.5 degrees, whilst we can only afford 1.5 degrees, and we have about 12 years left to correct that trajectory, and it's by all means possible, by the way, at a very low cost to society. I would argue not a low cost, it's actually a significant benefit. More and more people are starting to realize that attacking climate change is probably the growth story of the 21st century in terms of job creation, in terms of economic growth, in terms of driving in inclusive growth. So this needs to get a lot of attention. We're trying to work that here at the WEF, but obviously at many of the global forums. And I really encourage you to be there at the Secretary General's Forum in September, where we can hopefully push the countries to more ambitious targets, because 2020 is going to be a crucial year. The other one is income inequality. You know, in any system where too many people feel that they're left behind or not participating, it will ultimately rebel against itself. And then we're all surprised again that we have the issue of the yellow jackets or these election results. You'll see far more of it. 2020, 2019 will be a year that I think more and more people will put on their yellow jackets in many countries in this world. People have really felt that since the crisis, we've clearly seen that the banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. And Oxfam again came out with quite some stunning statistics, sadly as it may be, but every year they tried, you know, to come as a shock effect, but then they succeed next year to shock us again. If you now look at the bottom 3.5 billion people, they've actually seen their combined wealth, the bottom 3.5 billion people, 3.8 billion people, have seen their combined wealth go down by 11%. And then you take the billionaires, nothing wrong with them, but the billionaires have seen their wealth go up by 12%. The 12% increase for billionaires is the equivalent of 2.5 billion a year. If you just take 1% of that combined wealth of these billionaires, you can solve the issue of food security, you can solve the issue of education. For example, 260 million children not in education because the parents can't afford it. So there is an incredible job to be done, climate change and inequality. And we have the time to do this. We only have the 12 years to solve this. The main thing that we need for this is to work at a different level than what we've done until now. Just to keep knocking on the same door and to keep doing the same thing over and over again is that famous definition of insanity that Einstein talked about. You won't get the results. We're on that trajectory. We're a little bit like frogs in a boiling pan as far as I'm concerned, and we need to snap out of that. The only way that we can snap out of that is working in different levels of partnership. And that's exactly goal number 17 for the SDGs, which is worth rereading, because it's not just a partnership of a relationship that we've always had in the past in working together. No, it's a partnership for the common good. It's a partnership where we put the interest of others ahead of our own, knowing darn well that by doing so we'll be better off ourselves as well. It's an intergenerational partnership. These are different levels of partnerships than any of us are used to or any of us are trained for. Probably one of the reasons why an average tenure of a CEO has dropped to 4.5 years. We all know that in order to do these partnerships, certainly across all these sectors I'm talking about, from governments to civil society, academics, private sector, requires a different level of trust. And it's very easy to see that, as many people have said, often it comes on foot and it leaves on horseback. And boy, do we have many horses around nowadays. And I'm surprised that companies keep going like this. What you call goodwill or intangibles now used to be 15% or so from a company's asset base if you go back 40, 50 years ago. Now it's about 70%. And any time we open a Financial Times or any newspaper for that matter, and we see that that trust is being violated, you see not only that most likely the CEO loses his job, but about 30% of the value of a company is being wiped out. It's not surprising for that reason that increasingly the financial community is getting involved and trying to figure out what these non-tangibles are and how they can become measurable. The companies live off trust. All the brands that we have in companies like Unilever or our corporate reputation I talked about, but it's the same in our own relationships and in our own lives. It would not work if we didn't have that trust. That trust is actually the glue that makes a complex system, in the case of Unilever being in 190 countries, work. Otherwise you'll have rules and regulations and you stifle yourself or you shrink yourself to greatness, and that's not a good thing. If there is low trust in the system, which is happening now, there's a hidden tax. I haven't made the calculations yet, but to implement the Sustainable Development Goals would be an additional $2 to $3 trillion a year on the current trajectory that we're in. Very minor, by the way, in the grand scheme of things. I would argue that the lack of trust that we have currently in the system, call it the trust tax that we're paying, is significantly higher. If you don't believe me, just take one goal. Take goal number 16, peace and justice. We're currently paying for conflict prevention and wars, 10 to 12% of our global GDP. Infinitely more because of that lack of trust, the tax that we're paying, than what it takes to address these issues in the first place. We've become strange human beings. We rather deal with the consequences and pay more and more for that than that we take out the time and build the relationships and the partnerships based on trust to attack these underlying causes. And then we keep calling ourselves still the most intelligent species. So what is trust? To be ordered to have a system of trust, you first and foremost need to be trustworthy yourself. And if you look at the definition of trustworthy, I'd say very simply it's worthy of confidence. It takes people that are authentic, that understand the meaning, the true meaning of the word fairness, of equality, of purpose, and at the essence of it, have courage. I always say a true leader, first and foremost, is a true human being, authentic people, but you need to have that courage. Interestingly, courage comes from the French word cœur, which is the heart. So we're doing pretty well with the head in many places, but we've forgotten the heart. Which brings me to the main issue of trust is really, do we care? You cannot be a trustworthy individual, you cannot build that trust if you frankly don't care. Do we care when we buy a $1 t-shirt that people in Bangladesh and many other places are kept in slavery? Clearly not. Look at fast fashion. Do we care that small island people are drowning, literally drowning, whilst we're standing here because of climate change? Apparently not, because we keep going. Do we care for the homeless or the people left behind because of unfortunate instances in life? Apparently not. We're walking past them every day on the streets, whilst we know how to build houses. Do we care for the 840 million people, and the numbers going up, by the way, that go to bed hungry, not knowing if they wake up the next day? Apparently not, because we find it very cool to waste 30 to 40% of the food. So if we can't answer that question first of if we care, you can never get to that level of trust or trustworthiness that we're talking about. Now, there are some good things in the survey that Richard puts out today, and one of these things is obviously that 75%, I think that's your numbers, I have to quickly look at it because there's so many in there, but that 75% trust their employers. I think that's the main thing. Because at the end of the day, most people work for others, and if most people work for others, and if that is where the higher level of trust is now going to, first of all, it sends a message to the companies that you're better walk the talk to be able to earn that trust, but it also is an incredible opportunity to leverage this enormous community that you have there to create the movements for change. Because I ultimately believe that these movements of change that we need now to change the world in this direction that I talked about will definitely come more from the next generation, or the young, the millennials, the Z, if you want to, than from anybody else. They've understood that less bad is not good enough anymore. They're telling companies to change from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to what I call RSC, responsible social corporations. That's quite a big step change, that's quite a difference. But that push, we even see that in a company like Unilever, comes as much from the bottom as we're trying to pull that up from the top. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for three reasons. I'm optimistic for these young that I talked about. I'm optimistic because we're at the point that the cost of not doing anything is higher than the cost of doing. So even the ones without a moral compass might have an economic case very soon. I'm optimistic because of consumers are starting to vote with their feet, or citizens of this world, increasingly demanding these changes that we're looking for. And I'm optimistic because finally, at the end of the day, the only thing that will change, if you want to, next to the people's behaviors and the levels of trust that we talk about, is actually the financial community. And believe it or not, despite what we see, despite that we read, I see movements in the financial community going in the right direction. So I want to leave you on a positive note that, that I think we have everything in our own hands to solve these challenges if we can be trustworthy, far more important than anything else. If we can create a system that we trust, and most importantly, if we put ourselves to the service of others. And don't forget, last but not least, to be trusted, at the end of the day, I believe is a greater compliment to strive for, actually, than to be loved. Thank you very much. I'll be rushing. Oh, sorry.
Hello. So, We've been doing the Edelman Trust Barometer for 19 years. We have just been in the field
How you
in
doing?
October and early November in 26 countries. We talked to 33,000 people. We talked to the so-called informed elites who are college plus, educated, 75K plus income, 4+ media a week, and then mass population. We do this online. And we started this study in 2000 after the battle in Seattle. You may remember that the NGOs stormed the Seattle meeting of the WTO protesting globalization. And we wanted to understand who the NGOs were. And we found that, in fact, NGOs were the most trusted institution in the world. And that has remained such to this point. The second thing that has evolved over this period of 19 years is dispersion of authority. We found, beginning in 2006 and 2007, that a person like you, someone close to you, became a very credible authority figure. And it was really a vote of no confidence in CEOs and in government. We then found that in 2008, the destruction of trust in, frankly, business sector was an incredibly big blow. That government rose to an unparalleled height, and that, in fact, government saved the world, which stopped in 2011 and 12. Impasse in Brussels over Greek debt, impasse in Washington over the budget, and then we saw a decline of trust in government because of scandals in developing markets. So trust in places like South Africa is now 15% in their government, an all-time low. We also saw that media, over a period of time, was like an airplane running out of gas. Going, but slowly sliding. And that became a crisis point last year with the battle for truth. Only half the people said that they were engaged with media. So what does 2019 show? Some very, very important changes. So what's happened this year is that trust, which started out as a top-down kind of phenomenon, the sort of Mosaic bequest to mankind from the Mount, actually moved to horizontal about 10 years ago. It moved to peer-to-peer. This year, there's an important change. Trust has become local. And it's partly a response to fake news, but it's also partly a response to something that I can control. I feel as if I can control my relationship with my employer. My employer has now soared to be the most trusted institution in the world. 80% in the US, 75% globally. This is a phenomenon that you must pay important attention to. Let us try to unpack the basic condition of the world as to trust. First thing to know is that the mass-class divide is back with a vengeance. When Paul talks about the haves and have-nots, appreciate that the underlying conditions are very similar to 2016, 2017. What's happened is the elite trust has soared this past year, and mass trust continues to stagnate. And this mass-class divide has now metastasized. It is no longer simply a phenomenon of the UK, France, the United States. It is now in markets such as India, or that gentle country called Canada. 20-point trust gap in Canada. Trudeau has an issue when we think about elections coming this fall. We also find that there's a gender gap in trust. For the first time, it is evident that women are substantially less trusting than men in institutions. And it's particularly true about their attitudes to business. In the United States, for example, a 15-point gap between trust in institutions among women than men. Why? Well, you can hypothesize pay, few women CEOs, and Me Too. Beyond that, there's a political aspect to trust. We find, for example, that in the United States, again, my best example, Democrats love media. 70% trust media. Republicans, 30%. Republicans love business, 67%. Democrats, under 50. So the divide is inherently political. Divides also occur as to industry. Tech continues to be the most trusted industry, financial services the lowest. There's also an important national aspect to trust. The emerging markets, particularly China, Brazil, and Mexico, lag. The highest trusted countries are Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. But importantly, I want to explain the mass-class divide. I want you to appreciate what's behind it. The fears of 2 years ago that caused the Trump election, et cetera, were primarily matters of fear about future, but as described by immigration. Today, the fear that matters the most is automation. 2/3 of workers tell us that they are afraid of being replaced by machines. They see a dire future for themselves. They believe, only 1 in 5 believes the system is working. Only 1 in 3 sees that their family will be better off 5 years from now. So in fact, it's not an immigrant I fear, it's a robot. On top of that, you see a very clear picture of dismay about future. Particularly in developing markets, I want to point out that corruption spikes have also caused a diminution of trust in the elites. So what we have is a desperate search for control and taking back power to yourself. This is manifested by a stunning rise in engagement with media this year. For all of you who are in media or have been in media, you should feel very good because the engagement with media went from 50% to 72% in 1 year, an unparalleled rise in the 19 years we've been doing this. And the number of people who are not just reading but amplifying has doubled. We have 40% of people now who see a story and then share it. They are deeply involved in the process of news and also discussion. That is a very positive sign. However, people don't feel that that's enough. They are taking control back onto themselves. Example, the Gilets jaunes, cited by Paul Polman, but also the Women's March, the Women's Wall in India about treatment by men, but also within corporations. Pay attention to the 20,000 people who stood up and walked out at Google 1st of November. Also, people at Salesforce who said, I'm not working on a border patrol program. It's a full employment economy. People believe that they have the ability to influence what happens at the corporation. That's why transitioning, my employer becomes the most trusted institution in the world. Again, 75% globally, 80% in the US and other developed markets. What's the implications of this? Very important for CEOs to understand that 75% say, we expect CEOs to go out and act and not wait for government. Here's paralyzed government, here's the possibility of action through CEOs. And they also want CEOs to address issues related to being my employer, specifically pay, diversity, and retraining. Underline that word because they're afraid of machines, retraining. On top of that, there's a big expectation by employees that a company will not simply pay them, it will also empower them with information so that they are able to contribute to the discussion. And on top of that, that the company will have a social aspiration, some big idea. So, in fact, an employee, in response to positive stimuli, will do multiple things. Will advocate for you, will be loyal to you, and also engage broadly in the community. So, our basic hypothesis in trust this year is a profound change in landscape. It is trust at work. In effect, in a certain way, if you use an economics phrase, it's microeconomics as opposed to macroeconomics. It is that trust is now put into the locality. It is something that I can see in the eyes of the CEO or the leader and understand and feel part of and feel confident in. So we want to propose today an idea of trust at work, which is that smart companies, such as PayPal, and congratulations to Dan and to Franz and team for your incredible donation last week to American workers who were furloughed by government. Thank you for that. 4-point plan. Point 1, you've got to have a big idea for the company. You've got to have a mission. You've got to have a purpose, something that people can really feel strongly about. Second, you've got to inform them. You've got to inform your employees first, not last. You've got to make them your primary objective, not your customers, not your shareholders, not your communities. Your employees are your first order of business. And if they're informed, they will speak on your behalf. Third, multinationals have got to focus in their home market first. You've got to make a commitment, whether you're in Palo Alto, whether you're in New York, or whether you're in Delhi. You've got to make your community work. And that means education, that means health, whatever else is required. And again, I salute Microsoft and Brad Smith, wherever you are, for your $500 million donation to affordable housing in Seattle. It's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. And last, you need CEOs to stand up and speak out. At a time when 75% of people say that they believe that business can make money and improve society, this is the new mandate for business. It is time for business leaders to step into the void. We have an absence of leadership. We have populists who are whipping up sentiment. We need to go back to the micro of the firm and persuade people by our actions that, in fact, trust can be restored. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Richard, for that very rousing call to arms. My name's Gillian Tett. I'm the US Managing Editor of the Financial Times. And as some of you may know, I've been moderating this panel at the start of the Davos week for several years now. And I can truly say it's one of my favorite parts of Davos, partly because the findings of the Trust Survey are always very interesting, but also because having done it for several years, it's fascinating to see how trust has evolved in the last decade after the financial crisis. Some really quite fundamental shifts, not just in terms of trust collapsing in many institutions after the crisis, but also trust moving to what people who are anthropologists like myself call distributed trust patterns, instead of trust in elites, trust in people like you. And now, of course, the new theme of trust in your local community, microtrust, and looking to companies. As a journalist, I find that there are some points of the survey which are quite encouraging. I love the idea of rising engagement in the media. That's totally self-interested. But other parts of it are deeply alarming. I mean, the idea that only 1 in 5 people thinks that the system is working for them is terrifying. The fact that you see that ratio even higher than that in countries like Japan, the fact that so many people are scared of the future and scared of robots is startling. So, Dan, you've been on this panel with me actually, let me quickly introduce the panel first. Those of you who can't read the little booklets in front of you, let me quickly say, on my far left, to your right, is Alan Jope, CEO of Unilever. Next to him is Penny Pritzker, the former Commerce Secretary in the US and now running PSP Partners, an investment group. Next to her is Alan Bajani, who is head of Majid Al Futtaim, which is a Dubai-based consumer goods group. And it's great to have a voice from the Middle East here, given that these are indeed global trends. Dan Schulman, who I'm about to pick on, is president and CEO of PayPal. And next to me, on my left, your immediate right, is Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the former Danish Prime Minister and now CEO of Save the Children. Dan, since you have been on the panel many times before, let me pick on you first. What surprises you about this year's survey?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here as well. Richard, thank you for those remarks. And Alan, congratulations on your new responsibilities. I think, there are a lot of statistics in the report, but the one that probably disturbs me the most, you called it out as well, is I think it was 1 in 3. Only 1 in 3 people think that the world tomorrow will be a better world. That's very disturbing because, my favorite quote, some of you have heard me talk about it, of democracy, is that democracy needs to be more than 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. So think about it. And so that means democracy to thrive means we have to rise above our own self-interests. And if we're disillusioned with the system, if we don't believe that our children will have a better life, that the dreams we have for ourselves and for our families are less likely to happen, it's not that we're not voting against it, we're just voting against the system. And to me, that's really where I feel it is so crucial for the private sector to step up. We had a dinner last night, Penny was there, and we talked a lot about the role of the private sector, the role of CEOs, the role of purpose and profit, working hand in hand in a powerful way. And I think this is more important than ever before. I think we as CEOs not only have the opportunity, but the moral responsibility to step up and lead in areas that are consistent with our company's values and its mission. We can't be about everything, but we should have a mission that inspires. We should have values that support that, and we need to stand up for that. Just one other quick thing, because I know we're running short of time. I think what can make that even more powerful, but more difficult, is if we can figure out ways of private companies coming together in partnership, working hand in hand around issues, and then working with the public sector or NGOs to magnify that. That is going to be a new model, I think, for what we need to think about to make a difference in the world. It's hard, but I'm optimistic because the CEOs I talked to today all realize we need to have a purpose that drives. Our brands have to stand for not just making money, but having a vision and a mission.
Right. I mean, I'd like to turn to you, Alan, because, you know, if you're being cynical, and as a journalist, I'm paid to be cynical, you could say...
That's what we love about you, John.
Well, you know, you could say, well, okay, you have lots of, you know, very good sentiments coming out of the World Economic Forum this year, but isn't this just a case of elites seeing that there are the pitchforks at the gates, populism is rising, this is just a bit of virtue signaling? What would you say to that, Alan?
You might be right. I think it's time for business to take the responsibilities that we're given. We try to think at it at three levels, that purpose is the bridge between the responsibilities of business and the trust that we earn from the many stakeholders in our companies. Ours is rooted in three beliefs. The first is that companies with purpose last, that brands with purpose grow, and that people with purpose thrive. And when we start talking about, I'll skip talking about companies and brands for the interest of time, but when we give the people who work with Unilever the opportunity to align their personal values with the mission of the firm or the brand that they're working on, it has a startling effect. We've put 20,000 people through a program to discover their purpose and see if it fits what they're doing every day at work. And the impact is incredible. Engagement scores shoot up, retention shoots up, and we now have 90% of people who say they're proud to work at Unilever. So when we can do that with our own employees, first with our own employees, I agree with Richard on that, but expand it to the 3 million people who work with our business every single day, I think at that level we can have an impact that goes beyond just the elites conversation at Davos.
Right. I mean, before I turn to Alan, I'd just like to ask both Alan and Dan, I mean, again, just being cynical, you might say, well, this is a phenomenon which has come out of a bull market and a period of strong global growth. Is it going to survive a recession?
I think if it was typical sort of corporate social responsibility set off in a part of a company, like, you know, a foundation or something that's funded through profits, then maybe it would. But I do think the companies that embed purpose and mission in everything they do, including their products and their services, I actually think it's the opposite. I don't think we should underestimate how crucial it is for a company to have incredibly engaged and passionate workers. You said 90% are proud to work for Unilever. At PayPal, it's 94% are proud to work at PayPal. That's a huge competitive advantage for us in the marketplace. If you have employees that are proud to be there, passionate, They serve customers better than anybody else could possibly do it, and you serve customers well. You serve shareholders well. And that purpose and value is what attracts great employees. So I don't think, and by the way, I think companies that react to pitchforks and that kind of thing, they're way behind. I mean, this is something that needs to be part and parcel of who you are as a company, who you are as a leader. It should not be a reaction to what's going on, nor should it react to, the ups and downs of a marketplace.
Right. Now, Alan, it's great to have you on the panel because much of this debate about populism, about the problems of the elites, and rising disillusionment in institutions thus far has been conducted in a very Western framework. How is this playing out in the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East at large, we operate in 20 countries around the region. And it's the same issues. I don't think there is a Western and Eastern view about trust. It's the same. I think the context may be different, and we've seen that in the past 2 years. I think Middle East has taken center stage a bit more than before, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. But the reality is we all have the same priorities. We live in a world where there is no place anymore, in my opinion, at least in our customers' eyes, to actually organizations that are here just to make money. It is not a luxury, it is not something, it's not a good to do, it's a new normal, and people will either adopt and adapt, or otherwise, it's a matter of time. Now, yes, you would say, is it gonna survive a recession? And I personally think that it's gonna smooth any recession. Organizations that are really purposeful are organizations that will actually do much better in this kind of situations. Now, going back to, I would say, the Middle East, you see, I think 2 countries are surveyed in the barometer, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and you see that the trust in government is extremely high. We're talking about 84% or something for Saudi and 80% for the UAE. I'm not surprised. I think when you look at that, you see that these governments have been really dealing with the issues that they have been, I would say, suffering from for the past 70 years. Now, the UAE is different than Saudi Arabia, but the reality is, I think, one of the most responsive and responsible government, to go back to the WEF theme 3 years ago, in terms of their actions and what they're really doing, is the UAE government. They have been doing fantastically well in really prepping their country, nation building, and trying to actually lead globally on a number of fronts, and I think they've been doing very well. To be fair, it's not without its challenges, but the reality is, I think people appreciate having a government that is thinking ahead and not being taken by its own, I would say, its own vices.
Right.
There is less of that in one way. On the other side, we see that actually there is a big awakening in that part of the world, that we can't continue to do what actually was normal before, and things have to change. I think that's really appreciated.
Right. Well, that's certainly a very strikingly high level of expressed trust in the government in that area. But Penny, obviously the US is a country which doesn't have that level of trust in government. How do you feel, as someone who used to be in government, at the revelation that actually Americans today don't seem to have trust in government? They only appear to trust their local employer.
I'm not surprised. I would start with, this pessimism regarding government is to be expected. The fact 8 in 10 people don't believe the system is working for them is not surprising given what's going on. And frankly, I think the root cause is this lack of real inclusive growth. The system hasn't worked. And if you look at the data, for those of us who are in the 1%, or the 0.1%, our income is up 4 times in the last 40 years. For the person who has a high school degree, or a man, an average man in the United States, they're behind and losing ground every single day. So the reaction, and then you add automation and innovation and technology and artificial intelligence on top of it, and I don't blame people for being terrified. So the question, though, to me is one, and I want to build on something Dan said and something that Richard said. I think the solutions are local, and I think the solutions require partnership, and that's why they're hard. It's one thing in your company, and I love what you said, Alan, about helping your employees find their purpose. I think that's an incredible start because it begins to build an optimism. But frankly, that's the case or possibility only for certain businesses. And so then the question becomes, what is the role that I think people are looking for the CEO to play? And I think it's really one of an ability to put together partnerships that can solve problems. The ability to say, we've got to understand what do we need to train our workforce for, and work with local education institutions and others, to better combine our resources. We have lots of phenomenal resources, but many of them are working in silos. And they're looking for this local leadership beyond, they see governments aren't working together, they're too partisan, et cetera. So they're saying, well, look at the corporation, they're nonpartisan. They can bring these groups and assets together, and we see it, saw it as Secretary of Commerce all over the United States, where cities came together, where business leadership came together with educational leadership, with the government, with the NGOs to say, we have a challenge in our local community. We're going to go after solving that.
Right.
And great progress is being made locally. You're not feeling it across the country. You're feeling it in particular communities. And I think that's where what Richard was saying about multinationals need to think about their home base a little bit more than they have. The forces have said you've got to, spread your resources like peanut butter across the world where you're doing business. But the reality is they can't forget their home base either.
Right. So in some ways, a solution for a wave of populist anti-globalization is to think ultra-local. But Heli, I'm curious, NGOs, as Richard said, is one of the only institutions, are one of the only institutions that have actually seen trust levels stay pretty high. They've dipped a bit over the last decade. How do you feel hearing companies almost start to talk like NGOs, use some of that language? Do you think that a group like Save the Children is at risk of seeing its role usurped? Do you think that actually we should try and keep things clean and make sure the NGOs do the NGO stuff and companies look after profit? I mean, how do you see this new trend developing?
First of all, good morning to all of you. Thank you, Richard. It's amazing you've done this for 19 years. I didn't realize that until I started reading this stuff. It is quite impressive, and I think it will be even more important in the years to come, because I think trust will be attacked in different ways in the years to come. I'll come back to that. I've been in politics, so I know about trust in politicians as well, and now I'm in the NGO sector. And it is true that we had very high levels of trust in the NGO sector, but even our sector, in Oxfam, in Save the Children, we've had issues where we had to look at the way some of the stuff that we have, the way we behaved, and how we also have to in the future be more accountable, more transparent, and to regain some of the trust that we have lost. So this is one of the big discussions we have in the NGO sector right now. But I want to come back to this notion of trust which have gone local. I think that's a super interesting finding. In many ways, it's not surprising, but it's very interesting. But I think the most interesting in what answers we have to that. And there seems to be developing a consensus that because trust has gone very local, the answers have to be very local as well. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that it's only, I love what you guys are doing. I love that you're actually trying to bring your employers' values in line with the companies and try to leverage that for retention and better client relations and all these things. But I think we need to ask ourselves the question, is big business, big corporation ready to go the extra mile to create that trust? And do big business understand what that means? That means new standards for transparency, accountability, asset sharing of assets, living wage for their employees, taxation wherever they work to a completely different level. And I often find in this discussion about going local and being really very good as a company that we forget the big picture that will actually change the world. And I could go on and on about trust, but I think the most important thing about trust for the individual is that they trust their institutions, meaning the institutions have to not be corrupt. It is about fairness in society, meaning that if I put in my fair share of work, I will be able to have a decent life. It's about fairness and equity. It is about feeling that the big institutions under here, the big corporations, that they play by the rules and pay their tax, for example. And it is about me as a citizen feeling that I'm a shareholder in society, that I contribute, and that when I contribute, I also get agency, and I get the assets that society can give me: free education, free healthcare, nature in a good state. All those assets that mean that my well-being can go up. So I think the big question for us is not to localize trust. I understand that we have to do that to a certain level, but also ask the really big questions about, are we actually changing the way we govern globalization in a way where it can be more trustworthy, because it actually starts from the global governance of globalization to be more fair. That's where trust will take us, I think.
Well, Helle, you put your finger. You put your finger on a very good point, but you also put your finger on a potentially very big transatlantic divide, because the European social democrat model of trust and fairness really is about the idea that there's a big role for government and that essentially companies, even Silicon Valley companies, should pay taxes properly in their local market, or especially Silicon Valley companies, and that essentially things like free healthcare and free education are a right. And it's a vision of, if you like, a much more inclusive social democratic vision of society than has been around in America until now, because of course in America companies are talking about local projects and local philanthropy rather than all talking about paying lots of tax.
I'm not necessarily saying we should pay a lot of tax. I don't think that is necessary. I think there are very good studies show that if you get to a certain level, I think it's in the over 20, we can start actually giving all children in the world an education. I'm just saying that in order for people to keep trust or to regain or to gain trust in these days of globalization, they have to be shareholders. They have to be able to see what's in it for me and my family. And that means that they have to be given assets, like you are a shareholder, assets that are meaningful for you as a family.
Right.
And that's why it's not enough with the local changes. It needs to be global. And as Klaus Schwab will say in a few hours when he opens this Davos session, that we need to think that globalization 4.0 is a time where we think of a new global governance system that we can all join in.
Right.
That will create the trust.
I mean, Dan, I'd like to turn to you because, of course, you do come from Silicon Valley, which has a rather different sense of this right now.
Well, first of all, it's been a great conversation, but I think when I talk about local, I don't necessarily mean Palo Alto or the United States. What I think about as local is what is core to the mission of PayPal. So for us, it's democratizing financial services. And that means like managing and moving money should be a right for everybody, not a privilege just for the affluent. It's a global concern, and our values ought to reflect that around diversity and inclusion. But what that means is that's what we should focus on. Like, we can't focus on everything that he talked about, up there. Like, we have to focus on what our mission and vision is and what our values are. That can go across the world in terms of that, but we have to focus on what can we make a difference in and where do our values make a difference in that. So it is understanding what we're good at, where we can make a difference, and shining a light on that and standing up for that with courage to go and do that.
Right. Penny, yeah, I was going to actually ask you in a moment about the women issue, but I see you want to comment on this issue of inclusion.
I don't think that local is necessarily in conflict with the idea that we need global solutions as well. But I think you can't, I'll take the United States. You cannot, getting granular about the lack of inclusive growth, you can't divorce a state's budget, their pension obligations, economic development, and job training and education. Those are all intertwined, and those get solved locally in our country.
Right.
They don't get solved nationally. And so that's why I think business has a real opportunity locally to push our governments and our society to come to solutions and create models that can be replicated. That doesn't mean I'm a huge believer in multilateral engagement, and it's hard and it's messy and it's difficult. But if there's one lesson I learned when I was in government, which is it's absolutely essential to solve the most challenging problems. So I don't think it's an either or.
Right.
But I think CEOs cannot solve all these problems.
Just,
But
if I could
before
just do
yeah.
one quick thing. You can make a difference locally, and then it expands throughout.
Right.
When we pulled out of North Carolina for HB2, the bill that allowed for the discrimination against somebody for sexual identity or orientation, that was a North Carolina issue, but it spread across the country and became sort of a rallying cry for the Department of Justice, et cetera. So I think you can act locally and then see that spread.
Right. Just before I come to you, Alan, I just want to turn to Penny quickly, though, and ask, when I hear someone like Helle talking, as I said, there's a bit of a difference transatlantically in terms of the emphasis, or there was. Because if you look at someone like Alexander Cortezia, what you're seeing now amongst the Democrats in America is increasingly the candidates who are standing up and embracing an emphasis on fairness, on 70% taxes, are starting to win a lot of support. Do you think that's going to lead to something like the Democrats?
70% taxes, who pays that?
Well, that was one of the proposals going around. I can see, Penny, you're shaking your head in horror at that idea. But do you think, the serious question is this, when you look at these trust figures that are coming out of a country like America today, do you think the next logical step from that is going to be a surge in, say, the populist left?
You definitely have a surge of populist left. Do I think that that's going to be what ultimately dominates in the United States? Personally, I don't think that that's a winning formula for the United States. I think it's more of a centrist, and I think that that's the lesson, aside from, particular candidates that get a lot of press. If you look at the 2018 election, what it really told you is that it's the moderate woman in suburban and exurban America is really the swing voter, and that person, and I'm generalizing obviously, and so not to create, but that person is not a leftist. That person is more, in fact, a bit more conservative, and in a funny way is a centrist, maybe center-left, center-right, but that's who that person is. And that's my assessment, that's the swing voter in the United States. But, we're going to get the opportunity to see in this upcoming election a vast variety of approaches, and trust is going to be fundamental. People are going to look, and they're going to look at all these folks and decide who they trust. And so, because that's ultimately what underpins an election.
Right. Alan, sorry, I cut you off there. I see you were keen to... Unless you wish to comment on Alexander...
No, I just wanted to comment on this global-local thing. I don't think that's the right axis to discuss global-local. I think we all have to play our part. And that begins with what you do in the space that you have some immediate impact on. But everyone sitting here has convening power. So first we have to get our own houses in order to build trust in the environment that we can directly impact, and then use our convening power to get the multi-sector partnerships going that can operate at a higher level. And I don't really know what to do with the comment, start in your home market. I think Unilever's home market's probably Asia. It's where the biggest part of our business is. So I don't like the global-local thing. I think it's get your own house in order and use your convening power to build the partnerships that can have bigger impact still.
Right. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a moment, so do start thinking of your question. But first, Alain.
Julian, I just wanted to comment on I think there've been a discussion, global, local, etc. Great. I think it's very interesting. But I think there's also a great opportunity that we're seeing today out of these results. I mean, CEOs have been the least trusted for quite some time. And suddenly we have an opportunity today, which in my view is a great opportunity because now people trust their employer. And I don't see how you can decouple the CEO from the employer. So the CEO being that non-trusted entity historically, okay, is actually now have a great platform to really own the narrative again. And influencing locally, but owning this narrative, not just locally, but also globally. We have a big role to play. If I think about the Middle East, but I think every part of the world, every region, being in the US today, Europe or elsewhere, or Asia, or the Middle East, there are always specificities here and there. But actually there is one thread that's there, a silver lining. The CEOs of today have a fantastic opportunity to own this narrative and to really drive change. And this is something that historically, if you take, CEOs have been shy from doing as much. I think corporations have done. Some have done greatly, but not as much. And this has been reflected in the Trust Barometer. If you go back to the Middle East, for example, CEOs never owned the narrative about what's happening in that part of the world. There's always been kind of, trying to keep themselves at arm's length from what's happening. But in reality, the real driver of change is the private sector and the CEOs owning this narrative.
Yeah.
And I think there is so much to be done. It's a fantastic opportunity. We see it in the results.
Yes, well, that's a very good point to make. I must say, it is quite a remarkable cognitive shift. If you go back a few years ago, there weren't many MBA courses that were teaching the future CEOs to go out and become social warriors. I take away 3 key points from this discussion, which has been fascinating. One, this year's report is an absolute scream of anger and pain by the ordinary populations against the establishment and elite. And if anyone tries to sugarcoat that scream of pain and anger, they're wrong, because it's very, very startling. Secondly, I do find the degree to which the cognitive map of the corporate world has changed in the last decade quite remarkable. I mean, if you try and think back 15 years ago to the World Economic Forum, even the World Economic Forum, which is about a lot of sometimes pious statements and commitments, was not producing this kind of language from the world of CEOs. And the third point, though, is that there are clearly a lot of challenges out there in terms of trying to turn these very bold new promises into actual practical action that won't actually break trust yet again. So good luck, and thank you all for listening.